When does an enemy attack? When you're at your weakest and you're most confused. And the outside world may well suspect that right now of the United States. A country in the grip of a pandemic, a president who has had COVID, and a vitriolic election. Is this really a dangerous moment for the US and its allies? You're watching Roundtable. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Perhaps cyber attacks on the United States, possibly military adventurism by its enemies. How vulnerable is America, and who could take advantage? At a recent rally in Florida, Donald Trump was hoping to rejuvenate an election campaign as he tries to get over a disease that's killed more than 200,000 Americans. His diagnosis was just one reason for concerns about America's national security. In early October, 2 senior officials tested positive for COVID-19. Almost all of the military's joint chiefs of staff decided to self-quarantine. Add in the chaos of the international pandemic and the turmoil of an election campaign, there's been speculation that the USA is at its weakest point in living memory. So is this really a code red moment for the US? And will others seek to take advantage of a perceived vulnerability? Well, I'm very pleased to say that we can welcome to this round table out of London, Klaus Dodds, Professor of Geopolitics at Royal Holloway University. Then we say hello to Mara Oliva, Associate Professor in US Foreign Policy, that is at Reading University in the UK, and we cross to Washington, D.C., where we welcome retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Great to have you all on the programme. Klaus, let me come to you first of all. Do you think what we've seen in the last few months, maybe a little bit longer, but particularly now coming up to the election, highlights a certain vulnerability, a fragility from the US's point of view?
Well, I think the last couple of months have been really very difficult to watch for anyone who wishes the United States well. I mean, I think there are a number of things here. The most immediate is we've witnessed arguably the most divisive presidential campaign in most people's living memory. We've had almost unprecedented scenes where, for example, newspapers were reporting that the Secret Service have actually drawn up plans in terms of how they might yet remove President Donald Trump if he refuses to accept the election result next month. But I think more generally, what we're also in the midst of is a longer-term concern that the moral authority of the United States, or the US-backed international order that's been so important in the post-1945 world, is really under sustained assault. And it's not only affecting the United States domestically, in terms of perhaps that sort of loss of confidence about its mission in the world, but it's also inviting a great deal of speculation about what might come after that international order led by the United States.
General Kimmitt, let me ask you, from an international point of view, even if the administration doesn't see it this way, are outside actors looking at a certain vulnerability in the US right now?
Well, they may be looking in their mind at a certain vulnerability, but I think the institutions are still rock solid. I think that we may be seeing a lot of noise in the media, but I don't have a lot of concern that we will not only get through this election season, but will continue to move forward. Now, I can understand the points about perceptions overseas with regards to allies and moral leadership, but I think that's all they are, which is perceptions, and I think we'll get through this with very little problem.
But might it not lead others to take advantage of what they see as a certain weakness?
Well, they could, but I think that would be a mistake because, as I said, with the exception of what we would consider cyber operations in our media, I think most of the systems, our military, our economic, our diplomacy remain in pretty good shape, even though there may be a view from the outside that they're weaker than they have been.
I say this because Samantha Vinograd, who was a security advisor to Barack Obama when he was president, has put this out. This is a code red moment for the US government on multiple levels. It weakens any credibility that the US has in terms of being a competent global leader prepared to confront threats. She was referring at that particular moment to the hospitalization of the president, but those that commented on her comments said it was a much broader picture than that.
Well, I read the same article. It was dated October 4th. I think in the span of 2 weeks, we've seen that none of those concerns that she brought out have borne fruit. I'm often reminded of Secretary Rumsfeld's view about Joe Biden, the vice presidential candidate, that he hasn't been right on a foreign policy decision in his life. And I think it's also interesting to note that Sam is part of the Biden Institute, and I would be strongly suspect of her views, given that she's probably auditioning for a job in the next administration.
Okay, Mara, let me come to you. And Mark, I'll come back to you, if I may, in a little while to talk about your time as a serving soldier and what might have happened in the Pentagon when President Trump went into hospital. But Mara, let me ask you, if there are to be those who see this as a weak moment in US history, what might they want to do about it?
Well, I mean, there has been lots of talk of great power war again, and there is lots of talk in the media of a new Cold War with China and the rising power of China. I think we should be careful about that, to use these old definitions to look at a new situation. I mean, I'm a historian and I do appreciate the important lessons that the past can teach us. However, I think it's not helpful to use the old definitions to define new problems, and certainly won't help us to find a new solution. This is not a new Cold War between the US and China, simply because the historical and geopolitical conditions are different. That doesn't mean that there are no tensions or hostility between the two. But these are two very different countries, and we're facing threats right now that are transnational and go beyond political and geographical borders. Think about climate change and cybersecurity. And I think they require a new way of thinking and a certain level of global cooperation to be addressed and solved. So I don't think it's in the interest of everybody right now in the middle of a pandemic to start the type of attack you were talking about.
But the pandemic has also weakened American responses. Resources are being diverted elsewhere. And Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, has said that he does see this as a new Cold War with China. It's a difficult time.
Yes, it is a difficult time, and the pandemic, we cannot distinguish between domestic policy, domestic situation, and foreign policy. The president has used the pandemic to divide a country that is already dangerously polarized. If you combine that with the fact that he has undermined the public confidence in the electoral system, he has attacked one of the pillars of American democracy, the free press. He refused to condemn the white supremacy and endorse the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, and that combined with his America First foreign policy, then the standing of the U.S. in the world has definitely reached an all-time low. America's soft power is at an all-time low.
And what does that mean, Klaus, to the United States standing in the world? Can it recover quite quickly if that is the case?
Well, I mean, one of the great themes of the United States is the idea of regeneration. So that's an enormously appealing narrative the United States has about itself, that it can always resurrect itself, phoenix-like from the ashes. I think there are two aspects here. First of all, the United States moral authority has been unquestionably weakened by President Trump. He has, and his supporters have, worked tirelessly, I think, to undermine public confidence in fundamentals that make the United States a liberal democracy, namely its electoral system. Public culture has been weaponized. And although much of this, of course, lies decades earlier with some of the earliest culture wars that took a hold of the United States over issues like abortion, for example, in Vietnam, I think all of these things have intensified. And the other big shift, of course, has been public culture, public media. So when Noam Chomsky was doing his work about media framing all those years ago, he was just looking at the New York Times. Social media hadn't even been invented at that stage. I think the other thing that makes all of this really very distressing for those who wish the United States well is that we face two fundamental first-order challenges. One is climate change and the second is public health. And we need American leadership. And I think in the absence of that sort of commitment to long-term leadership, it's little wonder that others are wondering whether Russia, China, and others will leap into the fray opportunistically.
Mark Kimmitt, General Kimmitt, putting on your old military beret, if you would, what do you want to say about that idea of a code red moment?
Well, it certainly wasn't a code red in the Pentagon, nor at our combatant commands. Nobody was affected by the coronavirus. The systems continued on. But I want to address the point that was made earlier about this being even the notion of a code red moment. If you take a look at the years between 1962 and 1974, it was far worse. We had a president assassinated. We had a civil rights leader, the civil rights leader in the country, assassinated, a presidential candidate assassinated, an extraordinarily unpopular war in Vietnam. We had the Saudi oil crisis, the siege of Mecca. We had draft dodging, and we had a significant cultural change between a post-World War II generation that had fought and died in Europe and Japan, and their sons who were running away from the draft, wearing long hair, smoking dope, saying tune in, tune out. And we made it through that. The riots in 1968 in my hometown of Washington, D.C., virtually burned down the town, as they did in Chicago, as they did in Detroit. What's happening today, I think, is nothing compared to what was happening back then, both in terms of law and order issue and in terms of cultural change. And if we can survive that, we can certainly survive this.
So when the Pentagon says, as it did when President Trump was diagnosed with COVID-19, there's no change to the readiness or capability of our armed forces, our national command and control structure is in no way affected by this announcement, there would have been no jitters.
No, the ultimate jitter is what happens to the nuclear football, that briefcase that is carried by the president's aide. And the fact remains, had the president shown any ability or inability to perform his office, that would have simply gone over to Mike Pence. That would have been maintained. The chain of command sent out a message. All actions and orders remain the same. We continued training. We continued combat operations overseas. So all the people I've talked to said this was not a big deal.
Mara, let me put this one to you. In terms of other threats, cyber attacks are mentioned most readily. Do you think the United States is well prepared to prevent the sort of damage that we know they can do, particularly came out to an election with what Russia has done in the past?
Yeah, I mean, and I think in this sense, the Trump administration has done quite well. They have prepared for cyber attacks, or at least they have invested more in cyber attacks. Policymakers who pay attention to new threats have pointed out for a few years now to the possibility of what they call a cyber Pearl Harbor, i.e. a devastating attack on the country's critical digital infrastructure. I think right now the more immediate risk comes from attacks below these thresholds, so intrusions that can still cause great damage. Think about 2017 and how hackers exploited vulnerabilities in the Microsoft Windows operating system, which caused the damage for $4 billion, including to the NHS here in the UK. You know, governments, the US and the EU right now is doing very well, and probably governments around the world should follow the example in trying to think of how to agree to new norms about cyber war. One of the issues is that cyber criminals have gone often unpunished. So what level of cyber attack amounts to an act of war? What measure would serve to as an appropriate response to such attacks? So dialogue among the nations will be necessary to address these threats.
General Kimmitt, a cyber Pearl Harbor, would that be taking it too far?
Well, I don't think so at all. I completely agree with Mara that cyber capabilities are not properly defended against in the United States. We may be 99% defended, but it only takes 1% to get through. And I think if we take a look at what I could only call cyber psychological operations, the number of bloggers that you have that are coming from the basements of the Kremlin and inside of North Korea and China are really driving a bit of a wedge and amplifying this tension that we were talking about earlier between people inside the country. As I said earlier in the show, cyber remains probably my greatest concern in terms of not only warfare, but also in terms of culture. And the advances that are being made primarily with facial modifications so that it could look like Vice President Biden was saying something, but actually he is, that is simply a bot, I think is more and more dangerous to not only military capabilities, but cultural understandings as well.
And the US isn't prepared?
As I said, I think the United States is 99% prepared, but it only takes 1% to get through. And cyber is one of those areas that all you need is somebody a little bit smarter who codes a little bit better, and he could sneak through. We do have a significant amount of resilience in our critical infrastructure, but if you find one flaw in one reactor or one transformer, you can shut down the entire city of New York from their lights and their electricity.
So, Klaus, your thoughts on that, and then I'll ask you about other threats. So this one, a cyber Pearl Harbor, as it's been described.
I'm going to answer that slightly differently by saying that whilst we can focus our attentions on critical infrastructure, I think what we shouldn't lose sight of is critical cultural infrastructure. And I think for me, what I would be concerned about is the systematic assault on the idea of truth and public discourse that President Trump has worked hard with. So in other words, that, for example, if you combine the capacity for media to be made synthetic, in other words, faked, if you also think about the capacity for media culture to be spoofed, and the widespread usage of this idea of fake news, then what you do, I think, is corrupt the public sphere. So in other words, actually you're asking citizens to be skeptical about everything. Now, in public health terms, that has been utterly disastrous. But I think what it does is it weakens the United States further. Jimmy Carter once spoke of a sort of loss of self-confidence in the late 1970s. And I think he was ridiculed at the time for making that very public address. But actually, if you were to go back and watch what he had to say, I think there's a lot that you would think resonates in 2020. So I'm less worried about critical infrastructural attacks. I'm more worried about public culture in the United States, which then makes it more susceptible to the very thing that the general has talked about, which is cyber attacks. Because ultimately these things work in part, not only shutting national infrastructure down, but they corrode and pollute yet again public culture and a sense of conviviality and fraternity amongst citizens.
If we can put the possibility of cyber attacks to one side and physical attacks on the United States also to one side, the other area that I'd made notes of when it came to threats against the United States were what other powers could do in terms of their own adventurism in their own backyards. China, Taiwan, Russia, for example, and other actors such as Iran, Israel, et cetera, et cetera. Mark, do you want to sort of go through some of what you think the most important things to look out for when it comes to United States interests and foreign adversaries might be?
Well, what I find interesting is the way that China doesn't use weapons, it doesn't use military to increase its influence. But if you take a look at the way that they have inculcated and insinuated themselves into foreign economies, such as you see inside of Africa. I work in the Middle East, and we often say you can't swing a dead cat without hitting 4 or 5 Chinese businessmen over there. So they have been very good about working against our interests, our commercial interests, candidly by using business practices that Britain and the United States would never allow: bribery, outright gifts of thousands and thousands of dollars to public officials. And they have slowly and gradually gained a foothold both in the Middle East and Africa, and to some extent in South America, that we need to be wise about. Russia, on the other hand, is going back to their old proxy type of operations, the Wagner Group being a prime example of that. They've worked their way into Libya, they've worked their way into Syria, they've worked their way into Ukraine, and some would say they're actually working their way into the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan as we speak. So while Russia is taking somewhat of a ham-handed military approach, the Chinese are taking a very, very sophisticated commercial approach to extending their power around the world.
You see, that sort of leads me to wonder whether the United States has been paying proper attention, given the fact that it was Make America Great Again, or Keep America Great Again, given that it has been trumpeting its own potential successes in the Middle East with some of the deals that have been signed between Israel and other countries. Has the United States over the last 4 years taken its eye off the ball? Mara?
Yes, I would say so. I think one area that certainly they need to pay more attention. I completely agree with Mark's assessment, but I will add to the critical areas, the Arctic zone and what is happening in the Arctic because of climate change. The new possibilities for new trade routes and natural resources is triggering plenty of tensions. Who gets there first? Considering also that the law is very ambiguous over the Arctic area, the U.S. needs to pay more attention to this opportunity or missed opportunity right at its doorstep.
So it's time, Klaus, perhaps for the United States to refocus on the things that matter, not just to those of us outside that country, but also to the United States national security, perhaps.
Well, I would have thought so. I mean, one of the areas I work on in detail is the Arctic, and actually it's been quite striking in 2020. There's been a lot more interest from the United States in terms of Arctic strategy going forward, and I think that's probably very welcome, given that Russia and China have established an opportunistic relationship that is based simply on China giving Russia money to exploit oil and gas, and then China being a welcome market for said oil and gas. But I think there are other things worth noting. China is increasingly behaving like a global power, and part of that is, of course, through things like One Belt, One Road. Part of that is through building a whole series of economic and political relationships around the world. But there are other things going on as well. So two things I draw your attention to. First of all, China's growing influence and presence in global institutions, including helping to create and normalize new standards and conventions. Look out, for example, for 5G technology. And the other I would absolutely draw attention to is something the United States used to be terribly good at, which is soft power, cultural power. Look out for the growing investment in China's cultural industries, in media, in television, in film, because I think you'll see important clues about how China sees itself or wants to be seen globally.
You see, General Kimmitt, Mark, I was just wondering about America becoming, United States becoming too inward looking and thereby perhaps losing its grip on world power, if you like, on influence. Is it time to look again at what the role of the United States is in the world in the next 4-year cycle?
Well, I think we ought to wrap this into a simple explanation that over the past 12 years, America has become more and more isolationist ever since President Obama came in. He wanted to get out of Iraq, he wanted to bring his troops home, and that has been carried on by President Trump. It's hard to explain to the American people how we can spend billions and billions overseas to promote our alliance interests, but at the same time, in the United States, we have crumbling infrastructure, poor health programs, poor education. And President Trump came in and redefined it. He said, look, we're just getting a bad deal overseas. Europe, Great Britain can have these wonderful social welfare systems, but we've got to finance NATO. We've got to be the world's policeman. Maybe it's time to go back to this old Make America Great, which was an isolationist term used in the 30s to prevent America from being dragged into European wars.
So listen, this has got to be a quickie. We're running out of time, I'm afraid to say. Does that approach, that argument that both you think the President Obama and President Trump have put forward, that you have to look after your own before you can look after others, has that made America weak and in world terms vulnerable, perhaps, at this time? Mark Kimmitt.
Well, I think it just means that America is retrenching inside of its borders. It has two big oceans and two friendly neighbors. And when we're stronger, the world is stronger. But we don't need to be everywhere all the time spending our money when our own country needs the help it needs.
Much appreciated. Thank you for coming on the Roundtable, and thank you wherever you happen to be for watching this program. From me, David Foster, from the team that put it all together, and from my three guests, thank you. I hope to have your company next time. Bye-bye.